Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our moderator, Professor Janet McCall-Kennedy, who will introduce herself and introduce all of the people who will be speaking today. I'm very thrilled that you guys can all make it. I know that there'll be people popping in over the next half an hour or so. So I'm going to hand over now to Janet to welcome you to our first keynote.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and welcome to everyone around the world, here in Australia, in Asia, Europe, the US, and wherever. So a warm welcome, and I would like to just say a few words. I'm Professor of Marketing at the University of Queensland Business School, and also the Director of Research there. I've been working in the service area for quite some time, and delighted to have our guests with us today. Professor Mike Brady from Florida State University, who's been working in the frontline service area, looking at that interaction, that critical interaction between the customer and the employee. And he'll be speaking about a number of important concepts here and the way that we have to change perhaps some of the things that we've been doing in the past to capture the current situation and to change things. So in terms of the pandemic, in terms of social unrest, technological advances that have been occurring. And he's going to be speaking from his perspective too, as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Service Research, which we all know is the premium journal in this field. And then we're going to have two speakers from industry, taking very much the practitioner perspective. So our second speaker is Marty Janssen from the Ministry of Health, and he's going to be speaking about his insights that they've gained from audience insight research through New South Wales Health, designed to improve programs and health service delivery, highlighting the human perspective. So really very much focusing on how you recognise individuality, diversity as one of the themes that will be coming out in that session. So looking forward to that presentation also. And our third speaker, Allison Oben from Adelaide's Haunted Horizons, is the manager and owner there, and is going to take us into some of these other areas. So maybe if you think about it as paranormal, the experiential ghost tours that she's been developing there with her other people in the organisation to really give a very different human experience. So looking at it both from the customer and frontline service provider. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if you can keep your questions to the end of the session today, that would be very much appreciated, and to put that into the chat. And then I'll be able to pick up a number of those, hopefully most of them, and then present those back to the speakers for their views. So just a couple of points now, just before our first speaker starts, in terms of thinking about what's happening in service today. So services are being delivered in very many ways, from machine to human, machine to machine, human to machine, and we're seeing blurring of these roles between the various actors. One of the things I think that we need to think about here in this session, because we're wanting to highlight the human aspect of it, is to just reflect for a few moments on what it is to be human. So when you think, oh, that's not the way we should do things, that's not humane to do that, that's not what a human does, what does human mean? So there are lots of definitions around. I think this idea of sense of belonging, social interactions, emotion comes up quite a lot as well, and the human touch. So I think you'll see these threads in the discussions that we'll have today. Certainly emotions, so thinking about that full range from sadness, love, anger, happiness and fear in the world in which we're living now is very, very evident. Also, I think keeping in mind the rights of humans. So we can think about the right to safety, the right to information, a right to respect, dignity, to be heard, to redress. And you can see some others there on the screen. Going forward, some of the challenges I think we need to address as providers of service is to think about the customer experience itself, or the service experience, needing to be seamless, frictionless. And I think this is especially important when we bring in the machines working with humans, or machine to machine. How do we make this a seamless experience? Another aspect is authenticity. So when we bring in more machines and we have all these various interactions that are not so much in the physical space, but virtual, as we're experiencing in this pandemic, what is an authentic experience like? And we are seeing this blurring of lines between the various actors, and that's going to really impinge on what an authentic experience is. And thinking about that also brings me to another point about diversity. And I think we're seeing that through the Black Lives Matter and many other disturbances that we're seeing today, that we need to understand diversity, and diversity among not just the customers, but also frontline service providers as well. And we should be thinking about that unconscious bias. We might think from our own perspective, predominantly that would be a Western perspective, but not everyone in the world has a Western background. And so we need to be thinking about that in terms of diversity and access to services. So who will get these services in the new world? I think increasingly we're seeing that the personalised services are going to be increasingly for people who really can afford it. So we might be seeing a lot more of the haves and have-nots. And then finally, thinking about the involvement of the customers in different ways. So they want different forms of interactions and different levels of engagement and activities associated with them. So those might be some of the things that we should be thinking about as we go forward. And now I'm very delighted to welcome to our virtual podium Professor Mike Brady. Mike is the Bob Sasser Professor and Chair of the Department of Management at Florida State University. He's also affiliated faculty member or honorary professor at 6 universities around the world. Mike's primary research interest lies in the intersection of customers and employees in frontline service transactions. He has published widely and many articles in top scholarly journals, and his research articles have been cited very well, over 23,000 times to date. Mike has won numerous awards for research, teaching and service, including the Christopher Lovelock Career Contributions to the Service Discipline Award. And he is current member of the Board of Directors of the American Marketing Association and the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of Service Research. So very much a warm welcome to you, Mike. We look forward to hearing your presentation now. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Janet. Can everyone hear me? Just kind of, yeah, that, okay, good. Well, thank you for that really nice introduction. Janet and Rebecca were kind enough to approach me about talking about the academic perspective with respect to the topic of the day, which is the future of services and the human perspective, which is, as Janet mentioned, is near and dear to my research heart. I've done a lot of research in that area and kind of started off looking at that dyadic perspective between customers and employees, and that's evolved from there. So this is a topic that I'm really happy to present about. But the only downside to the topic is that it's really broad, right? So I'm talking about humans and the future. So when I thought about, what am I going to talk about today in 30 minutes and now 29 minutes, a lot of things came to my mind. You can imagine that a lot of things came to my mind, right? So this sort of happened in my head. How do I make this smaller, right? We can think about broad things like consumer well-being, and we can think about more narrow things like the intersection of humans and technology on the front line. And so where do you sort of find a happy home with respect to this particular talk. So what did I do? Well, I did what most everyone would do, including myself. So I checked Google, right? I Googled, and you know, this seemed like a good idea. I've gotten lots of good answers from Google. So I Googled, you know, future and humans, and well, yeah, that didn't help. This is what came up. This is how the human face will look in 100,000 years, and as I think we can all agree, it's really scary. So that I got nowhere with that. But the good news is I've since narrowed it down, and I do have an idea of what I'm going to talk about today. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to narrow the scope. I'm going to do that through 3 lenses. And then I'm going to talk about human-related research phenomena. Again, I'm the academic perspective, the scholarly research perspective. And the way I'm going to talk about it is through contexts, phenomena, and emerging areas. And then I'm going to finish up with discussions on sort of put my editor's hat on and talk about editor's gold. And I'll talk a little bit about implications for future research at the intersection of humans and the future. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started again. First item of the day is to narrow the scope using 3 lenses. And so I thought about, okay, how do I make sense of this really broad topic? And so I chose 3 lenses that I happen to really like. One of them is OFR, the Organizational Frontlines Research area. If you're not familiar with that, this was launched by several of my colleagues and myself. So Jagdeep Singh, Todd Arnold, and Tom Brown several years ago. And we've had quite a few symposia on frontline research. And it's a growing and I hope burgeoning area of academic inquiry. So that's the first lens by which I'm going to narrow down the topic. And then the second one is really putting on my editor's hat. I'm in year 4 of being an editor. It's my last year, sadly, but I've learned a few things about what impactful research entails. So I'll talk about that and use that as a lens. And then finally, of course, I am the editor of the Journal of Service Research. So I'm going to speak about research through the lens of the journal that I've been editing. And so I'll give you examples of some of the concepts I'm talking about, and I'll derive those examples from articles that have been published in JSR. So talking a little bit, I know a lot of you know what OFR is, but some of you don't. So I'll talk a little bit about that and make sure everyone knows what I'm talking about. So OFR is the study of boundary interactions and interfaces involved in the exchange of valued resources between an organization and its external stakeholders. So this is a definition derived from an article that the 3 of my colleagues and I wrote and published in JSR a few years ago. But in a little bit more understandable terms, the way I like to think about OFR, it's about what happens at the boundary of the firm, how it happens, and why it happens. So what happens at the boundary of the firm, how it happens, and why it happens, which you can imagine is a really broad, really dynamic, really interesting area that touches on lots of different things. And we'll get into some of those things in my talk today. A little bit more about the front line. You know, we're academics, and of course it was incumbent upon us to create a 2x2. And so we did to sort of make sense of what the front line looks like. And we have on our axes, we have interactions and interfaces divided up into face-to-face interactions versus remote ones, and then high-tech versus low-tech. And of course, the topic of today is about humans. And so one way I narrowed it down is I'm going to take out purely technological topics, right? And I'm going to talk about ones that have to do with human interactions on the front line, whether they're face-to-face or remote or involving technology with humans. You can imagine that it's not just that you interact with an organization via a human or technology. Sometimes it's a blend of both, like when we check into the hotel where there's a kiosk and a frontline worker. So I'll touch on that as we go. The second lens I'm going to talk about is impactful research. And so, as an editor, you get asked a lot to do meet the editors sessions and to give talks. And one of the things people want to know about is how do you define impactful research, right? What should I be doing research on that would get you as an editor excited? And I'll circle back to that topic here later on. And what I came up with is there are 3 things. I mean, I know there's more than that, but 3 things I can talk about today. There's new contexts in which you can do research, and looming phenomena, and then finally an emerging area. And the way I look at that is new contexts, as we go from the top to the left to the right, new contexts are more about the present day. So it's a new context that's emerging now, and research is going to follow, as we know, a year or 2 years later, because it takes a year or 2 years or sometimes 3 years to get articles through the process. Whereas looming phenomena is a little bit more futuristic. So it's doing research today and publishing it today, and then it has application 2 or 3 years down the road, which is more impactful, you can imagine, right? Because you're predicting what's going to be important a couple of years later, and therefore you're sort of setting the stage for that research area. And then from the most impactful perspective is an emerging area. It's an area that is launched by a particular research team, whether it's you and some colleagues or otherwise, but it's the seminal paper from which other things emerge, and that's really, really impactful. Okay, and the last lens I'm going to use, as I mentioned before, is JSR. Most of you would be familiar with it, but JSR is a global, multidisciplinary, method agnostic outlet, and it seeks to publish the 3 R's, right? Rigorous, readable, and relevant service research. And just a little bit, I actually gathered these data myself, and it was interesting. No more than 22% of the authors that published in JSR last year were from one country. So it truly is a global journal, and we're very, very proud of that. Okay, so those are the 3 lenses, right? So the impactful research, JSR, and these contexts and so forth. So we dive right in. I want to talk about a new context from the beginning, and this is something that you're seeing in the pages of JSR and other service, rigorous service outlets, and it's navigating the human technology divide, right? So that divide between where frontline employees, as one example, and technology intersect, right? So as one example of that, that topic that was published in JSR, Dwayne Gremler, and again, this was 3 years ago, he wrote an article about the interplay between high touch and high tech, right? And so this was sort of, at the time, a looming phenomena, right? And we see more recently, these are articles that were published very recently, and we see author teams picking up on that trend and looking at various aspects of it. So for example, Jonas Heller and his colleagues looked at augmented reality and how do you manage augmented reality at the intersection of humans and technology. More recently, Jagdeep Singh and his group of practitioners actually really looked at how do we develop a one voice strategy. In other words, there's lots of technological interfaces where humans and technology intersect, and how do we manage that in a way that creates a one voice or creates one voice from the corporate's perspective. Really interesting article that just came out. More recently, I think, or sort of from a different lens, navigating the human technology divide has taken a turn to where we're looking a lot at robotics, right? So Jenny Van Dorn and her group of very esteemed colleagues looked at automated social presence through the lens, again, of robotics. And more recently, you can see that lots of articles have come out in JSR on that particular theme. So again, we're in the present day because we're navigating the human technology divide through robotics. And you can see that quite an esteemed group of authors are publishing in that particular area from lots of different angles. So it's a very interesting human technology related topic that's happening right now in the pages of lots of journals, including JSR. Now, as we switch from sort of the present day to a little bit more of a futuristic perspective of what's going to be impactful, right? As we think about moving from articles that are in JSR to articles that will be in JSR, that's what I call a looming phenomena. So one of the examples of that, Janet touched on in her intro, which is managing unrest on the front lines. Unfortunately, we're having to manage unrest on the front lines in ways that we haven't in the past, and also in quantities that we haven't in the past. It's much more common now that we have unrest on the front lines. And so if you're an author and you're looking to really have an impact on the service research field, one thing you can do is sort of predict what's going to happen down the road and write an article that creates the foundation for a whole research stream. And that's what I mean by looming phenomena. So if, as an example, and I'm not sure if these author teams had this in mind, I'm not sure if they were really predicting the future in this way, but Mark and his group looked at customer ethnic bias in service encounters. And they submitted the article several years ago, but it's more relevant now than it ever was, even when they submitted it, right? And so that's what I mean by looming phenomena. It's something that when the article is published or when it's submitted, actually as the submission process moves forward, it becomes more and more relevant, even to the point now where it's incredibly relevant for what's going on the front line. Same thing with Ella's group, looking at anger intensity on the front line, right? That this is much more common, unfortunately, than it was before, even when they submitted the paper. And so this hopefully will be an article from which other people draw inspiration, which is the definition of impact. So I hope that makes some sense. And then you can think about managing unrest from different perspectives, right? So there's the customer perspective, and that's happening, right? So we have the employee perspective and we have the customer perspective, and there are articles that were published, interestingly, by myself and Janet. One of those several years ago, we wrote an article with Paul Patterson about customer rage from different cultural perspectives. And we were very much interested in the topic. We've been doing some research on it, but I don't know that any of us, Janet, you might correct me, I don't know that any of us knew how relevant it would be several years down the road as we look at how things have transpired. And so hopefully that's one of those articles that sort of sets the stage for other research, and we can see that's happening, right? So Christina and Jochen worked on angry customers, and Francesca and her group looked on the same topic from a B2B perspective. And then we have Alex Henkel and his group looking at customer incivility on the front line. And again, this is a bit of a futuristic perspective that's more applicable now than it was when the paper was submitted, which again is going to be a more impactful research undertaking, because hopefully it creates that foundation for other people to draw inspiration and to work their own research programs from. So as we turn to the employee perspective, same thing, right? So there's articles that were a bit futuristic when they were published, and you can see some examples of those that were published in JSR. And so it's not just customers that are dealing with unrest on the front lines. Employees are dealing with that unrest at levels that exceed the customers, right? Because it's impacting them every day, because they're in the frontline environment all the time, whereas customers get a break. They get to go home and they get to go to the frontline when they choose to do so, whereas frontline employees are having to deal with this throughout every day of their work life, right? So again, it's a bit of a futuristic perspective looking at human-related phenomena on the front line that's very, very applicable today, and therefore, I think by definition, impactful. I think it will be very much impactful. Last one, and this is one that we sort of saw coming, and it's sort of at the boundary between a recent context and looming phenomena. If you've been to the U.S., you know that tipping is a big thing here. It's probably too big a thing, but the norms are changing. In fact, it is too big a thing. But the norms are changing with respect to how tipping is done in the U.S. Now that you know, with technology and so forth, you can either tip before getting a service experience, right? Or you can tip, as we traditionally have, afterwards. And so this pre-service tipping phenomenon is occurring. And so there's some authors who published some papers in JSR looking at that particular topic. And you can see the top one, Nathan Warren and his group are looking at that from the customer's perspective. So this is an article that just came out. Raymond Lavoie and his group are looking at that from an employee perspective. And again, but at the time it's very futuristic, and it's starting to really apply now. And then you can see that Giampolo and his group are looking at that from a pay what you want pricing perspective. So sort of the pay before or pay after phenomenon, looking at strategic implications from both the customer and employee perspective. So again, the idea is that if you can predict something that's going to become more important in industry, say 3, 4, 5 years down the road, and do research on it now, well then there's a really good chance that your work will be the foundation from which other people draw inspiration. And that, by definition, is one of the ways we define research impact, meaningful research impact. Now, as we move from that to an even broader macro futuristic phenomenon, the ideal scenario is that you as an author or a researcher or an editor are responsible for launching an emerging area, an area that will spin off a whole research stream, right? And so one example of that, and I want to emphasize one word, the long-term implications of the current climate as one example. I think that might be an emerging area. In my perspective, I don't think we're going to forget about the current climate we're going through, whether it's the pandemic or social unrest. I think these are things that are going to be ingrained in the human psyche moving forward. And so frontline managers, service companies, corporations are going to have to deal with the implications of the current climate moving forward. And those are the kinds of things that editors are interested in. So I'm getting papers that are taking existing phenomena as one example, and they're saying, well, how does this change in the current climate? And that's not as interesting to an editor as folks who take a long-term perspective and say, look, I'm not talking about what's going on right now with the pandemic, because we all hope, obviously, that in the next several months, 6 months, whatever it is, a year, we address the pandemic in some meaningful way. And so that this research will have fewer implications. But what won't go away are those implications. The fact that consumers, as one example, as we look at Len Berry's work, consumers don't feel safe right now on the front line. So service safety is something that is much more important now than it has been, probably, at least in my country, since 9/11, where people don't feel safe. And so companies have to develop strategies, manage customers in ways that enhance service safety. And so Len Berry and his group of really esteemed authors are looking at that particular topic. And I think that has long-term implications for what's going to happen in the service literature. And that's great. That's what you're looking for. That's what impact is built around. Clay Voorhees and his group also looked at these kinds of topics through the lens of frontline employees. Same with Ed Bond and his group are looked at that from a B2B perspective. So these three articles are coming out in the next issue of JSR, and they all deal with the pandemic. They all deal with different aspects of corporations and how they're dealing with the implications of the pandemic. And I think this has long-term implications for how we do research, what we do research on. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to go away in terms of the human psyche. We hope it goes away with respect to the pandemic and the individual social unrest issues that are going on right now. But I don't think that's going to go away in any time soon. So again, that's an emerging area. Now, if we switch topics just a little bit, I've been talking about things that are impactful. I've been talking about it through the lens of the journal and the three areas that I think sort of define impactful research, or three areas, not the three areas. And so one of the things that I think is a worthwhile question that I had to ask myself when I took over as editor is think about, what is an editor looking for in a submission, right? What is an editor looking for in a submission? I'm talking about impact, and I use this visual a lot. I had to think about this, and it hit me, or at least from my perspective, this is what the editor is looking for. You know, all papers in journals like JSR and other reputable service journals should be rigorous. That's what the review team does. That's what AEs do. That's what I do, is make sure they're rigorous. But the ones that really get us excited, the ones that have sort of lasting appeal and long-term impact, are the ones that are not just interesting, but also impactful. And that's the sweet spot. Those are the ones we're looking for. And when I talk about the futuristic ones, looming phenomena, when I talk about emerging areas, that's really the sweet spot of what editors are looking for. And I'll get back to that topic here in a minute. But for now, let me give you some examples of what I mean. And I talk about this through the term editor's gold. So I get, I think Rebecca knows this too, but I get 500 papers across my desk in a particular year. And I love them all. You can imagine, I love them all. But the ones that I get particularly excited about, I call editor's gold. So for example, editor's gold might be conceptual papers that launch a research area, right? Conceptual papers that launch a research area. So for example, and putting the two together, whether it's a research area or a new theory, you can imagine how excited the editor of Journal of Marketing was when SDL, the Service Dominant Logic paper, came across their desk, right? They saw the future, the impact that particular paper would have on the field, and it certainly has, obviously. Or papers that introduced important new constructs and scales. And I find that too often authors sort of underestimate the value of properly introducing, conceptualizing, and providing a theoretical foundation for a new construct, along with a reliable and valid scale. Because again, the job of the editor, and again, I'll return to this, but the job of the editor is to set the stage for future research. That's what we do. And these are things that get us excited. So a couple of examples. I mentioned Len Berry and his group. I think that's a conceptual paper that might just do that. It needs a scale. It's a construct that needs a scale. If it's going to be important later on, we need to know how to measure it. And so there's an opportunity right there to do some work that should have lasting appeal. An article that we just published just is coming out in JSR that Josina and her group published is on service ecosystem design. Again, it's a very futuristic look at service ecosystem design, and I happen to think that it's going to have a big sort of long-lasting impact on the field. It's a conceptual paper that is integrative, and I think it speaks to the audience that does work in that area. And those are things that, again, that I find exciting as an editor. I think other editors do as well. Other things that pique editors' interest, review articles that integrate literature streams and move the discipline forward, right? So we do all this work as researchers, and we tend to do it like this, right? So there's people working in all kinds of different areas, and we're publishing all over the place. And it's rare that someone steps back and says, okay, there are a lot of people saying lots of different things in this literature stream. Someone needs to take a step back and make sense of it all, right? Someone needs to develop an integrative framework, a conceptual model that says, okay, this is how we make sense of all the different literature streams. And that is super valuable, because you can't move forward in an emerging area in a literature stream until we establish some kind of common understanding about core phenomena. And these kinds of papers do that. And so that gets editors excited as well. And so if you can do that, you're really doing the service research area a service. So Eve and his group, I think, did that with the service recovery journey, sort of looking at recovery, which obviously has been a lot has been published in recovery, but looking at it from a new lens and a futuristic perspective. And this article happened to win the Best Article Award in JSR for that particular reason. So these are award-winning papers. And one that's just coming out, a paper that's just coming out that I think does a really good job of this, is something that Valerie Zeithamel was working on. I sort of talked her into working on this particular topic, and she graciously agreed. But the perspective was that we've been using the word value lots of different ways, right? And so depending on which research tradition you're from, you use the word value differently. And so I said, Valerie, was one of the original people to ever write on value, right? And so I said, someone needs to make sense of this. Someone needs to say, okay, there are different ways we're using this word, and this is what the different ways mean, so that we can establish, again, that common understanding that allows us to move forward in important ways. And Valerie's group did that. I'm really excited about this paper. It was a massive undertaking, a lot of work, but I hope the service research area gained something from it, because it, again, it's very integrative, which is important and impactful. And then lastly, papers that speak to and address what the discipline thinks it knows. So sometimes we move in a direction, again, we do all this research, right, from different areas, and we sort of develop a common understanding that may or may not be exactly right. And if you're familiar, if you go back to your philosophy of science days, there is no, science isn't the answer, right? It's an evolution, right? So we continually test our theories and our propositions and our theorems, and we sort of perfect them over time. And so if you can do that as an author, so for example, Pascal and his group really looked at warmth and competence in customer service provider relationships, which is a growing area. It's done a lot of work not only in marketing, but in OBHR and psychology. And they looked at that particular topic from sort of a macro perspective and made sense of it to move forward. And that's also editor's goal, and that's also incredibly impactful. And again, it very much has to do with the human perspective, which is very important, at least for the topic of the day. And then finally, I'm going to finish up. I think I'm doing okay on time. I hope. I'll talk a little bit about future research implications. And one of them is, and again, I'm sort of a Pied Piper for the OFR group. The front line is a fascinating research context. So I hope you agree with that. It's something that I guess I only have one regret for the time I've spent as editor. It's just that I haven't been able to do as much research over the past several years than I did before. And I sort of want to get back to that, because I really love doing research at the front line. And I do because it's dynamic. It changes as humans change, and we change a lot. We're changing right now. Unfortunately, we're changing in ways that are quite painful. But as an eternal optimist, I believe that pain will ultimately lead to better things ahead. But that's happening as we speak. The frontline invites a multidisciplinary lens. It has to integrate OBHR. It has to integrate sort of MIS and IT technology, because the boundary is a very dynamic place. It also calls for a variety of research methods. So no matter whether you're a qualitative researcher, or you like to write conceptual papers, or you're an empirical researcher, or what we call quant researcher, all of that applies to the front line. And so it invites lots of different folks. And then finally, it's the source of important human-related problems, right? So everything from customers to other customers to employees to managers, and even the C-suite, which, by the way, hint, hint, is an area that really needs more attention, I think, in the service literature in general, but particularly in the front line. How the C-suite impacts the front line is something that I think is an interesting topic that has received little attention to date. And then finally, it's also, if you step back from phenomenon, we look at societal implications, culture, and the so-called bottom of the pyramid. There are really important implications for the front line that play out in these societal, cultural, and bottom of the pyramid lenses. So I hope if you're not familiar with the front line and not excited about it, hopefully you are more of both. Other future research topics that I thought I'd mention: clearly think about the long-term implications of the current climate. I'm getting lots of papers now that are looking at things we know, and they're saying, okay, well, we don't know what it looks like now that COVID's happening. And I'm not so much interested in that. What I'm interested in is for researchers to say, look, here are fundamental ways that customers and employees, managers, C-suite executives are going to change moving forward. And these are fundamental changes in what we think we know as a result of that, right? So you have to think broader, and you have to think more futuristically, I think, in order to get editors excited about the kind of work you're doing with respect to the current climate. So in my viewpoint, customers won't forget the pandemic. So things like service safety will be important for quite a few years to come, unfortunately. Same with social unrest. And innovations will continue to blur the boundaries between technology and humans. This happens every year. It started several years ago in our literature with robotics, or didn't start, it continued with robotics. But there are other, augmented reality is a good example. AI technology, there's lots of different things. Blockchain, how is that going to impact what we think we know about service phenomena? So think about the future, think about long-term implications, and I think you'll have a better experience in the review process. And then finally, I kind of alluded to this earlier, ask yourself, what's the editor's job? Very few people do that, and I had to do it because I'm an editor. But I think it's really useful for people submitting to journals to think about that. Like, what's the editor's job? And for me, it's a simple answer because I try to make everything simple. It's to move in important ways, to move forward in important ways that are long-lasting the areas covered by the journal's content. So to move forward in important and long-lasting ways the areas covered by the journal's content. So we as editors are interested in sort of having papers that establish a research area that'll have a long shelf life. So this includes making sense of literature streams and correcting what we think we know. Now, don't get me wrong, filling gaps is important, right? Filling research gaps, and I think a lot of researchers think about research questions in that lens. And that's important and it's necessary for the scientific process to continue. But if you ask me, and you ask, I think, a lot of other editors, Rebecca will have to answer this herself, but the gold is in the original. The gold is in the original, because what you want is a paper that establishes something important that will always live within the pages of the journal. And that's the one, those are the ones that get us excited, the ones that are futuristic, engaging looming phenomena and establishing emerging areas. So with that, I'm going to finish my discussion, but I have to, on behalf of my colleagues, I have to give a shameless plug. So if you haven't heard, the Florida State University will be hosting the Frontiers Conference. And if you missed out on that, there's a website you should take a look at. We're hoping we host it June 10th and 13th. We're still hopeful we'll do that. So be looking for more information on that particular topic. And again, I'll be hanging around. If you have questions about anything I've said today or anything I haven't said today, I'm happy to answer them at the end of the session.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike, for that. You've really covered a lot of ground in the time that we have allocated to you. So very insightful discussion there. I think you've picked up really a number of issues that will be carried through, and hopefully we will get some questions, more questions into the chat box. So my next speaker now is Marty Janssen, who has 20 years experience in the public health area, and he currently is social marketing and health promotion program manager at New South Wales STI programs unit in New South Wales Health. And he has had an award-winning down to test social marketing and play safe digital communications program. And I think this work really fits in very well to what Mike was just talking about in terms of service safety. So this is a very important area, safety of our consumers and frontline people. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Marty, and about the insights that you've gained from the research there. So hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Janet. And thanks to the conference organisers for inviting me to come along and present our work today. I assume you can hear me all right. Yeah, so I'll continue. So yeah, we're really excited to present some of the work that we've been doing here in New South Wales in Australia around working with young people and improving access to programs and services, improving engagement with young people into programs and services, particularly around the interesting area of sexual health and STI testing and prevention. And really a couple of years ago when we really instigated this audience insight research, it's changed the nature of how we identify our audiences and our customers and how we understand them and then how we engage them. So we've really seen some significant improvements in all of those areas about identifying audience, engaging and understanding them and delivering services and programs to them since this important research was undertaken by us. So I'll present some of the detail of that research today and then also how it's been applied in one of those award-winning programs that was just mentioned, which is also a really kind of dynamic and interesting setting to deliver programs and services to young people, which is in the music festival environment. So just a bit of background. Previously in New South Wales Health, and I guess in a lot of health services, we have very blunt ways of differentiating our audiences and understanding them. We usually have historically done that really basically by demographic differentiation, so by age, by gender, by cultural diversity, by sexuality, or by place of residence, like metropolitan area, regional or rural area. And obviously those are very blunt ways of understanding a customer and audience. And then ways to engage them. Well, we had very nebulous terms to describe our customers and our audience. One of the ones that was quite common and prevalent within our setting is the term at-risk young people, which doesn't really kind of mean anything to most people or to young people themselves. So what we felt that we needed was this really better way of understanding our audience, and not just by demographics, but by psychographics. So understanding the intersection between their values, attitudes, and behaviors, and kind of the meaning that they place in their life and what motivates them. So even with that deeper level of understanding, we could better work with them to deliver programs and services that had meaning to them in an authentic way. So we've done a lot of work in trying to improve service delivery, I guess, but really, you know, in terms of the human-centered approach, health services in our jurisdiction, and I think more broadly as well, often have a systems approach rather than a human approach. So we're focused more on internally on how we deliver things rather than externally on who we're delivering them to and how to make that experience better. So while there's been a lot of work done in that area about service improvement, it's kind of like with these large bureaucracies, they can be challenging and unmoving or unwielding at times. And so the other approach that we use is to increase demand within the population, because that has an impact on service delivery as well, and changing how services are provided. So I'll just take you through the research that we undertook. It's marketing research here, or segmentation research. So the first stage of it was to understand the terminology and concepts that young people use around sex and relationships. So we had some detailed focus testing or conversations with our audience around the language and concepts they use, and that went into the development of a quantitative tool that we then delivered to young people across our jurisdiction in New South Wales. We had over 1,300 young people complete that research tool. It really looked at all of the different concepts and behaviours and attitudes about relationships and sex, and was kind of promoted to be representative of the large group of young people by cultural diversity, by age, by gender, by sexuality, and geographic location. After that was completed and a segmentation was undertaken, we identified the most important groups for us in terms of that risk and the need for STI prevention programs and services, and then really did a lot more deep diving with members of those two key segments to really kind of improve as best we can our understanding of those young people. And the segmentation that was done is just very basically diagrammed here, is that there were 60 different segments. There was kind of 3 global different segments of young people, but then they were differentiated again by being sexually active or not yet sexually active. So the top line there, responsible innocence, and these are titles that we've given them based on their key differentiators. So the responsible innocence and the happily responsibles, for example, have similar values, attitudes. So once the young people from the responsible innocence group become sexually active, they're most likely to move into that happily responsible segment there. But because values and attitudes are fluid, there is movement between these segments, obviously. But that's kind of the sort of way that we can depict them. So it goes down the page from low risk to high risk. And so the 2 key groups that we feel most important for STI prevention programs and services are the experienced sex positive group and the dominant risk takers. There's an additional way we can map these segments. I hope this screen comes across all right, but there's an x-axis there about STI, the attitudes towards STI testing. Y-axis of I have a lot of sexual experience, so, and the size of the bubble represents that it's okay to have sex with someone on the first date. So you can see at the left of the screen there, where there's the least amount of sexual experience, and then at the top left corner is the attitude towards the STI testing is a good thing. So over on the right hand side are our 2 high risk groups would have a lot of more sexual experience, and differentiating between those groups, the experienced sex positive have positive attitudes towards sexual health behaviours, whereas the dominant risk taker group score more poorly on those scales. So I'll go through in slightly more detail the 3 sexually active groups here. There's so much richness in the research results and data that we've received from this research. So this is just a really basic snapshot, but I continue to go through this research report that was provided and learn and kind of come up with new insights every time. It's just such, the intersection again between those values, attitudes and behaviors is really rich and allows us to really kind of understand and then therefore deliver programs that are more meaningful to young people in these groups. So this group is characterizes themselves as being more responsible. They're not risk takers. They have strong values around things like you should be in love before you have sex, and therefore they have low numbers of partners. They're, over on the left here, you can see that they have a lifetime total to date of about 5.3 committed partners and 1 casual partner. So where there's a red arrow, it means that they're much lower in comparison to the total of the young people's population. Where there's a blue data represented, it means that they're the highest in that area in comparison to the greater cohort. And as a result, they do have good values and attitudes and behaviours around condom use. But here they have the lowest rate of STI diagnosis, and therefore we can really tailor our programs that to where the higher risk or higher need is, and not kind of the deliver programs to young people where it isn't a significant need. So the next group, which is the first of the high risk groups, named Experience Sex Positive. So these members of this group are also high risk takers. They like new experiences. They talk a lot about sex with their friends, so they're actively engaged in kind of learning about sex and relationships in essence to improve their sex life and their relationships. So they're quite engaged, they seek out information, they share some of the similar values that we would support around condom behavior as well as STI testing behavior. They have a higher numbers of partners, but lower numbers of committed partners, but higher numbers of casual partners. They're the group that identifies the least as straight. So there's a higher range of sexuality diversity within this group. There's good rates of STI testing already in this group. So they have the supportive behaviours for us, they have the supportive attitudes and values. They talk openly to their friends again. So if we can design and deliver programs and services to this group, they're then likely to share that experience within their social networks. So we feel that they've got a kind of important influencer role as well. And the final group, the higher risk group, is we've titled the dominant risk takers. So what's interesting about this group, they're also risk takers, but they don't share those same values and attitudes around sex and sexuality and relationships as the previous group. This group, interestingly, skews highly male, so about 2/3 male within this group. They are the smallest group within the greater cohort. And they have really poor attitudes around the effectiveness and ease of use of condoms. So therefore they have really poor condom behaviours. They've also got some concerning attitudes towards the value of respect in relationships. And they also have strong values around males should take control in relationships. So they have high rates of both committed and casual partners. And also down the bottom there, the highest rate of diagnosis with STI. So I guess because of the interface of those values, attitudes and behaviours, they are the kind of key higher risk group for us in terms of STI prevention programs and STI testing services. So what's been interesting, again, as a result of this research, is that we now have the opportunity to really understand our audience and our customers in a new way, differentiate between them, identify those that are more important, I guess, for us to engage with in terms of program delivery and service delivery. And we also have a typing tool that came out of this research, so that we have a 10-question tool that the responses to those questions will place you in one of these segments. So that's really important for our focus testing for program and service design. So we know who we're talking to. We can recruit young people from those 2 high-risk groups to really help us to design and deliver effective programs and services too. We also can build that into our evaluation. So we know in our evaluation of our programs and services who really are that we're engaging with and what their behaviour is. So I'll just now show you how that research has been applied to a program which is an STI, sort of an outreach STI testing service that is delivered within music festivals across New South Wales. So music festivals obviously really great part of young people culture, youth culture, and what the music festival provides for us is that it brings members of those two high-risk groups to the one setting, that we can design a program to be activated within that setting that gives us the audience that's important for us, or the customers that are important for us. So it's a great kind of settings-based approach to delivery of a service to key audience or customers for us that kind of gives us access to those people without having to work too hard. But what we did was that we recruited young people from those two high-risk groups to design the strategies for this program and services, the inclusions that would best engage them within this setting, and what's going to work best to kind of overcome any barriers or concerns they might have about engaging with an STI testing program within a dynamic atmosphere like a music festival. So I'll ask you to play that video now, Rebecca. So this is the short clip around the experience that will kind of give you a better color around what the program's like, rather than me describing.
Blender and the grass this weekend were tested for what? It's chlamydia. They set up a special chlamydia testing tent.
1 in 20 Australians between the ages of 15 to 29 has an STI. In a crazy music festival environment, we needed to disrupt and inform festival goers of the importance of playing safe and getting tested. So we decided to take the piss, literally, and created Down to Test, the ultimate VIP festival experience. Our area provides charging docks, glitter bars, free condoms, and the most coveted of festival perks, clean toilets. Clean toilet! To enter, partygoers simply had to give us something they were dying to get rid of: their pee. Down to Test offers partygoers a safe, on-the-spot means to get tested for STIs, with the results sent via SMS at a later date. Everyone who returned a positive result for an STI has been provided with the help to get treated. And the impact of our campaign wasn't just limited to horny attendees of music festivals. Word of our luxury toilets and relaxed approach to STI testing spread far and wide, first around Australia and then globally. News articles, talkback radio and television reports spread like, well, an infection, and included everything from the New York Post to Reddit.
Doctors have hailed their program for early detection of chlamydia in young people as a success.
Our campaign made STI tests socially acceptable and even attractive by giving people a VIP experience that broke down the barriers to talking about safe sex. And of course, got people tested. And we're not done yet, with over 6,000 tests and counting, proving that young Australians care about their sexual health, more than just a wee bit.
Back to you, Mike, to Marty, to share your screen.
Great, thank you. Yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the on-site experience for young people within that festival. So obviously the design of that program really looked at what was going to engage young people in that setting the best, and then overcome their kind of concerns or barriers to undertake an STI test in that kind of really social environment. And it helps to improve those social norms, because it is such a social environment and young people are coming in together rather than being embarrassed and shameful about getting an STI test or doing it in secret. Groups of young people are coming in together and supporting each other through that experience and really improving those social norms for STI testing, which is great to see. Rebecca, can I just check on my time?
Yep, 3 minutes.
Okay, great. So yeah, I've just really briefly the results, I guess it was mentioned in the video as well, that we've now activated that program and delivered that service at 14 festivals across New South Wales. And the benefit, I guess, as well, is that we can engage young people in various locations across New South Wales, because wherever there's festivals that we can visit. And over 10,000 young people have registered for that program over those 14 festivals. We've had some really fantastic results. So around knowledge increase, as well as the positive attitudes, social norms, and intention to undertake future testing have significantly increased as a result of the program. It's also really key to note that over 85% of young people that we've engaged through the program are from those two high-risk groups. So again, the setting of music festivals brings those young people together for us to, if we really kind of done our homework around understanding and engaging and delivering programs to them, that's going to show that level of kind of interaction from them. We do struggle with the dominant risk taker group they're less likely to engage with health services and they have poor attitudes around health services. So we've worked really hard to refine the program to improve our engagement with our dominant risk taker group. And one of the ways that we did that was we actually refreshed the design of the program and how we delivered this program to young people to activate within a heavy metal music festival, which was a really interesting experience. Again, we focus tested with members of the heavy metal crowd and that dominant risk taker group to see what would be most engaging for them, and then built that into the program, and we had really fantastic results as which shows the program was able to be kind of improved or kind of provided slightly different engagement strategies and then engaging in different members of the youth audience. In terms of our segmentation, we have a kind of pre-post evaluation. So we found that, you know, we were getting great engagement with the experienced sex positive group, which we would imagine, but less so for the dominant risk taker group. We also know that they're the least likely to complete a post-program evaluation survey. So last year we actually did a much more on-site, very brief segmentation analysis within each of the festivals that we were at, and we found that we actually the results of that were that just over half of the people that completed that survey were from the experienced sex positive group, and just over a quarter were for the dominant risk taker group. So again, it's kind of really great that we have this opportunity to understand who we are delivering services to on site, which is really fantastic again for us around refining and improving the program as we go. So I think the future, again, supporting the increased evidence for human-centered design. Obviously, there's some challenges within larger bureaucracies about how we're able to service redesign to move away from focusing on what's the best system that we can have to deliver services and to kind of taking much more of a human-centered approach. We are finding, as many others are, the convenience is a strong driver for particularly our audience or customers of young people. So how we can use tech to improve convenience for young people and to kind of deliver services to where young people are at, similar to the festivals program, but also in an online environment or using new tech. Obviously, again, involving key audiences in service design. So the ability for us to know who our audience and our customers are, how we are able to recruit them into co-designing services with us really gives us that opportunity to significantly improve the way we engage and deliver services to populations. And also the knowledge that understanding young people's motivations has been really key. So the dominant risk taker group motivations was one of the key. We found that they wanted more sex, and the way to get more sex was to have less STI. So it's if we can tap into what those key motivations are for our key audiences, then we can work the service provision that we delivered to them in a way that actually matches their and supports their life goals. And this is similar to some of the digital communications we now do over our primary website and social channels called PlaySafe. We're really aligning the condom messaging that we deliver to young people to fit into their existing life experiences. So it kind of provides a level of that more authentic engagement, not just wear condoms because we tell you to, but this is how you manage your well-being in other areas of your life, and condoms are exactly the same. So it's really, again, understanding what's going to work for young people, understanding them and engaging them and delivering services and programs to them really has kind of taken us to the next level of success, I guess, in working with this key population.
Wrap up, Marty.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Now to move on to our third speaker for today. That's Allison Oben, who is the manager and owner of Adelaide Haunted Horizons. and she's going to be talking about dark tourism and our fascination for death, around death, maybe torture, suffering, and really bringing, again, the human experience into this. So looking forward to your presentation now. Allison, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So just make sure my screen is working. All right. Now over to the wacky stuff, I guess. So I run Haunted Horizons, and we do focus on dark history and ghosts. It's all about the storytelling, and this is kind of where I want to go with this. So we'll go to our first slide. Now, I want you to meet George, and I always say how many people believe in ghosts, and not many put their hands up. And what I want to do is point out and try and bring to the fore that you don't have to believe in ghosts or not. George can be a very good tool for teaching. So a lot of you would agree that there is this big word across George, wherever George and Ghost Tours go. So hopefully by the end of it, I'll change your mind on this. So ghost tours are always seen as bunkum, people dressed up, doing tacky things, and kind of doing made up stories, which is destroying history. But at the end of the day, if it's done correctly and ethically, then it can actually be very important. And by the way, if I had $1 for every time I heard a person say, don't believe in that stuff, and then that second sentence, but there was this one time, then I would be rich and I wouldn't have to do ghost tours. So it would be much different. All right, so what I want to do is go into a bit of a journey into dark tourism. So definition of dark tourism: tourism that involves traveling or visiting places associated with death and suffering. So a lot of different places that you can go to, theme attractions, they're usually the made up ones, your zombie runs, things like that. Heritage sites, castles, museums, stately homes. Natural disaster sites, Pompeii would be one of them, I've been there. Crime sites, Jack the Ripper tour in London, very popular. Genocide sites like Auschwitz attracts a lot of dark tourism. And haunted locations, which is where we come into it. Now, out of all of those, probably for us, where we operate in that spectrum, would be heritage sites, so which have got the history behind it. We do interpretive walking tours, ghost hunts. Now, Haunted Horizons is in that unique position to exploit heritage tourism, but it hasn't been easy to overcome that big word, stigma. So, but a lot of venues are starting to learn that museums aren't cutting it anymore, that generations aren't coming to those museums and just looking at empty buildings. They want a connection. They want to learn something, but in a new way, and connect emotionally. For instance, if I said to you, hey, come to London, I'm going to show you the streets of London, I'm going to show you the buildings, tell you a bit of history, or come to London, I'll take you through the streets at night on the Jack the Ripper tour, and you'll still learn the history. Which one probably are you going to be attracted to? So, and that's where we come in, the storytelling. You've got to connect people. Now, everybody thinks that dark tourism is a fairly new concept. It's not. It goes back to the beginning of time, right where we just started back in mankind. People were paying to actually go to the Battle of Waterloo and sit on a far hill to watch the battle happen. That actually would be termed as dark tourism. And then this gentleman here, the great Thomas Cook, who you probably all heard of, 1841, he realized that the Industrial Revolution meant that there was a lot more money. People had money to spend. So he started up tours, he was taking money, and he was taking them on trains to various places. Some of the places he took them were to executions, which was very popular back in its day. In fact, one of the executions that he took them to was in 1849, which was a double hanging of the Mannings, and it attracted 30,000 people. So he was just a small part of that. 30,000 dark tourists, they would have been called now. Now, even Charles Dickens was there from the window, and he was watching all this, and he wrote up on how appalled he was at the behavior of these people. So deep in us all, there has always been that interest in this dark tourism. They were already popular. So The face of modern dark tourism, I think we're all aware of the genocide sites. We would kind of see that as the face of dark tourism at the moment, the Auschwitz, which attracts 1.5 million visitors each year. Cambodian killing fields, which attracts 800 people a day. And there's a, I don't know, there's a fascination as it's all. It's not that we want to glorify in it. We just want to understand it and maybe touch our own mortality. But using the killing fields as an example, it's very impactful if you stand there and you look at these masses of skulls. It brings it home exactly what happened. It's very sobering. But when you go away, have you actually connected with it? So, and again, it's all about the storytelling. What happens if I bring up these faces, these people? Suddenly it's not just a case full of skulls. Now you're actually looking at real people and real stories. And emotionally, that is going to connect you. Who are these people? Can we understand it better if we connect with the story behind these people? Should they do ghost tours? Never. There is an ethical line. I don't think there should ever be ghost tours in any of these sites, but storytelling is a very important part of connecting people emotionally. We are a tribe, basically. In every tribe, they had a storyteller, designated storyteller. It connected us, it bonds us. And I guess where we come in, we're actually that designated storyteller. So a little bit closer to home, this place in Adelaide as an example, this is Zed Ward. It belonged to what was our Parkside Lunatic Asylum, obviously very politically incorrect term now. So it's changed its name to Glenside Hospital. It was where the criminals were put. So if the criminals had a mental health issue when they committed their crime, this is the building they went into. It had been closed off for 30 years, so the public could not see behind those walls. And then it was privately bought, and National Trust opened it up as an open day. 5,000 people came on that first open day. We had 2 hours to get 5,000 people through. They were queued up all the way to down the street to the road. There is such that fascination. But they came in, they saw an empty building with empty cells, and that's great. But they'll go away not remembering that. They've seen it, ticked it off the bucket list. However, if you start putting the faces to it, we've taken 20,000 people through. These are the people. Who were they? What were the crimes? Why did they end up there? What was their mental health issue? Then people are going to remember it. So yes, you can. We do ghost tours here, and we do it in such a way that it can be educational, and the history of health, mental health, can be taught if done correctly. If done correctly, we've been actually praised by people who work in the mental health issue in the field. In England alone, 10,000 haunted heritage tourism locations are listed. So the heritage sites are realizing that people just aren't seeing these museums as approachable now. They're displays. They want something more. They're not there, don't want to be reading all this stuff all the time. They want some sort of emotional connection. So you've got castles, you've got jails, and you've got museums. Even our bastion of history in England, the Tower of London, even they've started kind of going into the dark tourism and the spooky tales. You don't have to believe in ghosts. Yeoman Phil here, who's pictured there, he doesn't believe in ghosts, but he knows that it's a good way of bringing in the tourists, and especially the younger generation. So, and that helps finance these sites. Some of the places I looked at, 2012 Choices UK said 68% of people believed in ghosts. 2017, an Australian one, 35% maybe believed in ghosts. 35% said they believe. That maybe will still be attracted to come because they just want to be sure, one way or another. 2018, 6 in 10 people believed in ghosts in the survey that they did. That's a lot of tourists to tap into to get these heritage locations into the mainstream of tourism. So Even hotels have embraced their haunted reputation. So you've got the Queen Mary, which I've stayed on myself, and the Waitmo, I apologise to any New Zealand people if I've pronounced that wrong, hotel, where I've also stayed. And of course, the hotel in Colorado that's made famous from the Shining movie. So all of these embrace their haunted reputation, and how they've negated putting other people off who are scared of ghosts, they've designated a room or 2 rooms. All the other rooms are fine. It's just these 2 rooms. Like the Queen Mary had a room that hadn't been open for a long time. They opened it up. You can't get in that room because it's booked out completely. So long waiting list. So they've embraced, they realize that tourism and the telling of these stories, dark history behind them, is attracting a lot more people. They're connecting a lot more. So what encourages a visitor to a certain destination is its ability to engage in unforgettable and truly inspiring experience that touch visitors in an emotional way and connects them with special places, people, and cultures. How do you reach a younger generation? Most of our guests range between 20 and 55. So we're going through YZ generation and baby boomers. I'm a baby boomer, by the way. The YZ are looking for an experience, not an empty old building, not a dusty display. They want an experience. The baby boomers, like me, we are interested in history and heritage, but we want it delivered in a way that we can connect with it emotionally.
5 minutes to go.
Okay. We know how to combine these with Haunted Horizons, telling the stories that obviously compel, astonish, sometimes scare, but they're rich in history and quirky facts, and these are the stories that will remain with them. At the end of the day, if you've been on a tour in a location, the stories will fade out of your head, but if you've enjoyed and you've connected to that building, it's going to be the location that stays with you. So down the year, 10 years, oh, I loved going there, Margam Castle, or I don't remember the stories now, but I do remember the location, and that's how you connect them. Ratio for ours, ghost tours and investigations, 8,553. I didn't do this year because of COVID, obviously our numbers are down. History tours were only 2,596. If I put history tours on that car, I wouldn't get many people taking interest. Put the ghost tour on there, then you're going to immediately get a little bit of attention. And that's how you get them in. Storytelling to true stories, but to get them in. Just very quickly, I'll skip through these. This is how the public are receiving the tours. Usually 4 to 5 star ratings. TripAdvisor, 4.9, 5 star. So it's being embraced. The stigma is slowly crumbling a little bit. The tourism industry has now embraced it. We are now multi-award winning. We're in the Hall of Fame for South Australian tourism industry. We became finalists in Telstra Business Awards 3 years running. So it is starting to be embraced. People are starting to understand, peel back those layers. Ethics. Ethics is a big thing, and it does come up over and over again. It's important to keep those ethics and do it in the right way as well. So I'll just go from Professor John Lennon's. When we go to these places, we see not strangers, but often we see ourselves and perhaps what we might do in these circumstances. So motivations behind why we go to these places. But we, as the deliverer, as a storyteller, it is our responsibility to keep it ethical. What is endorsed, he says, is respectful and enlightened touristic engagement with contemporary history and its dark sides in a sober, educational and non-sensational manner. So if done properly, and I will keep emphasizing this, you can utilize the love of the mystery of the paranormal to help highlight these heritage places and bring it into the mainstream tourism. We don't use tacky effects, no dress-ups, no thrills. We've proven that you don't have to do that. We let the buildings, the people who live there, and the strange experiences talk for themselves. And in so doing, by telling these stories, we get to explore the history of the place. So we now do have a reputation of keeping that balance and getting it right. And more venues are coming on board. These are just 6 of our venues here. So The future of dark tourism. It's only going to grow. It's been here since the beginning of mankind. There's always been that fascination. People want the storytelling. People want to connect emotionally with these places. And while heritage buildings are starting to crumble with age, a lot of them are needing a lot of money to repair themselves. And while simple museums become less and less popular with the younger generation, there's going to be a stronger need for tapping into something else like dark and paranormal tourism to help finance these repairs, to keep history alive to the generations that hunger for it, but in a more entertaining way. So dark tourism, as I said, has been with us most of our existence, whether we recognize that or not. It is a part of who we are, and done right, it can be a beneficial thing. So these three here, just for instance, you've got Penhurst Asylum, Waverley Hills, and Prospect Place. I've been to all three to do the ghost stuff, and all the money that we pay goes back into the repairs of these buildings. It's a good way of keeping these buildings alive and keeping the stories alive as well. How long have I got?
That's it.
Time? Okay, finish with this one. So next time you see George here, maybe whether you believe in ghosts or not, maybe look at George this way. Drop that, put in that, and look at George as maybe now a multi-billion-dollar industry that keeps history alive and brings the heritage into the tourism. It's all about storytelling, connecting, and emotion, reaching people's emotions. So with that, time.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Alison.
Thank you.
Fascinating. It is fascinating that we are drawn to those negative emotions, fear and sadness, even anger potentially as well, and some of the other senses that we might experience, you know, being in a place like that and getting chills, having, you know, this sensation of perhaps being back in there, but trying to understand the human aspects and what it was actually like to be in one of those prisons or asylums and so on. It is very fascinating. And I think one of the things here would be to try and keep it authentic. I mentioned authenticity of the experience at the beginning of the session today, and I think that would be very important, but most interesting. Okay, so we've had our three speakers now, and there are some questions on the chat. So we might go to that first one there from Rebecca. So this is one to Mike. The pandemic has shattered the ability for people to plan. What implications do you think this will have on our core decision-making theories? Mike.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I always think of it through how it impacts those kinds of theories that that speak to processing capacity, right? So there are lots of theories that predict biases in the way we process information and the way we make decisions. And you would think that, you know, this hasn't been tested that I know of, you would think that the lack of planning, the lack of time to make decisions would exacerbate those biases, whether it's a confirmation bias or looking for information that we think we know. We're always trying to take mental shortcuts anyway, but you would think that that would be in hyperspeed now. So I think there are lots of implications for that for service, you know, because people make mistakes, right? Those biases are called biases for a particular reason. So I'd be curious to see research that addresses that particular topic.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Mike. Did you want to add something there, Rebecca?
No, all good, all good.
No. All right, thanks. Okay, and this is a question for Marty. Involving young people, in co-design is not always easy. What did you do to ensure the ideas they generated for changing the service experience of STI testing were authentic and innovative? Marty.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. Obviously, as government, we can't hand over the design of services to our customers, and particularly young people. Obviously, there's lots of constraints and funding implications and systems that we still need to work within. But what we find is that working with young people, if we set what those parameters are and boundaries are around what's possible for where co-design is possible and what sort of things young people can have input and innovation around, then that kind of supports a bit more of that innovation on an authentic experience. But one of the key things, I guess, about the Down to Test program in particular is that the service is being delivered within young people's environment. So we're moving into somewhere that young people own, and then that's where the kind of the parts of the program that young people are able to co-design is what do we do once we're in there is really the keys to the success. So I mean, the hardest part about it was taking a health service into the dynamic and somewhat chaotic environment of a music festival. Once we're in there, it's showing the will that we have to go into a young person's space to engage them, to deliver a service in was the 50% of the work there. And once we got there, then young people will own the rest of it in terms of what the most successful way to engage them within that environment will be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question here from Professor Ray Fisk. This is to Mike and Marty. It seems to Ray that the organisational front lines and STI share the similarity of human with human contact. What can the two research fields and perspectives learn from each other? Maybe we'll ask Mike first.
Yeah, so Professor Fisk knows quite a bit about customer-to-customer interaction and trying to manage that. But I think what we can learn from Marty's perspective is that normally when we're talking about managing customer-to-customer interaction, we're trying to get customers to coexist, right? They have sort of an inherent sort of negative perception of folks around them. You know, if you're in a crowded environment, waiting time, that kind of thing. But in Marty's case, we're actually flipping that on its head. And that's an interesting perspective where we're trying to keep people, in a sense, we're trying to keep them apart, or at least keep them apart or putting them together in a way that's safer because they're willingly going together. Whereas in most of the research in the customer-to-customer space, we're trying to do the opposite, is to try to make them exist together. Whereas in Marty's case, it's the opposite of that.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, one of the key strategies that we have within this model of service delivery is that we employ young people as peer educators within our program. So it's the way to balance out the interaction with the health professional that is part of the program. But if we have young people who are part of that community working with us and doing that engagement, front of house engagement and kind of and ongoing engagement while people within our space, that really kind of smooths over the experience of young people within that space. They're talking to their peers, they're engaging with people from their own community, and then they're coming into contact with health professionals to do the health professional part of it. But for the majority of the time that they're in there, they're only engaging with their peers as the face of the program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thank you. We have another question now from Linda Alcow. This is to Mike and myself. In many countries, due to the pandemic, frontline employees are being called essential workers. We are seeing a greater sense of gratitude to professions that were not highly regarded in the past. Do you think this hype is going to continue beyond the current pandemic? In other words, how do you see frontline research changing in the future as new frontline roles are being created? Others redesigned, while many are disappearing. And then there is another subsequent question about how that impacts on our research methods. So Mike, in terms of the role of essential workers and the gratitude that's being evidenced around the world, would you like to comment on that question?
Yeah, I don't have data on that, but anecdotally, you know, I'm thinking back to sort of the last big event that changed what we think about frontline workers, and that was for my own perspective, 9/11. And there were folks, and they continue to this day to a certain extent, that they really appreciate firemen. The fire department of New York, you know, you see shirts and hats and all that kind of thing. It was super popular for 5, 7, 9, 10 years or so after the 9/11 event. But I think what you see is sort of kind of this, where people sort of forget the importance of those kind of frontline workers. So my sense is, to Linda's question, that yes, I think this phenomenon is going to last a while, but I don't think it's really long term. But you'll probably have a base level of respect that has been raised forever. But on top of that, you'll see this downward trend where people sort of think about other things. And if you think about that through the lens of the police force, right, there's an interrupting factor that has changed perceptions dramatically since that point in time.
Yeah, so if we think about perhaps beyond the pandemic to other catastrophes, so thinking about the wildfires right now that are raging in Oregon and other parts of the US, and we've had them certainly in Australia and other parts of the world, and earthquakes and tsunamis and so on. So there's heightened realization of the value of that work during that time. And yeah, I think it's a fascinating area that over time it might sort of go down, as you suggest, Mike, but perhaps overall it's raised. However, not so much to the police force, as we've been seeing.
I think an interesting question would be, how do you remotivate that line of thinking with customers to sort of draw on the respect that they had at one point in time? How do you remotivate that, 5, 10 years down the road in a way that has positive outcomes for frontline employees? And that, again, speaks to sort of that long-term perspective of thinking ahead about what's going to happen in the future, and then motivating research that will be important, because down the line there's going to be this downward trend, but sort of predicting that downward trend and then finding sort of strategies that offset that trend would be a really nice research idea.
Janet, we're just about out of time, so perhaps go to raise question for Allison and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes. Okay, yeah, sure. So this is from Professor Ray Fisk for Allison. This is the question. Are sensational stories the key reason why dark tourism is irresistible for so many people, or is there a different factor that is more influential?
I don't think it's so much the sensationalism. I think different people are there for different reasons, and there's been a lot of looking into this. I even look at myself and go, why? What? Because I would go, I haven't been yet, but I would go to Auschwitz. I have been to one of the other ones, Dachau. And I ask myself, why do I go to these places? And I think deep down is touching our own mortality. It's we want to understand why, what is the evil in people, what causes people to do this? Because it is a scary concept and we want to know what it's like. I think that's what drives a lot of people. Some people, I'm going to say, you do get them, want to do their selfies in places like Auschwitz, and which is just so, to me, so abhorrent, if you like. It's just not the place to do it. But I think there's a lot of reasons. I don't think there is any one reason. It's like, why do we watch these crime shows? Why do we watch the serial killer shows all the time? What is it that draws us? Is it because we want to be comforted that we would know a serial killer if you moved in next door? We wouldn't. They can be very charming. I think it's that needing to know, that needing to connect, and that needing to feel the emotion of being there. I think for me, thinking about it on myself, that's probably part of it.
Okay, thank you very much. And I thank everyone for their questions, and especially for our speakers. And I'm going to pass now to Rebecca. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, that was 3 really diverse speakers. I think it's a great kickoff for SERVSIG in terms of the human perspective on the future of services. So thank you so much to our 3 speakers. Our next webinar, which is next Tuesday, is how can we innovate by keeping humanity at the center of the service? And so this is a panel that will come to us. After next week, we'll have a keynote on the future of services from the technology perspective. And then we will have our final panel, which will be all about the moral limits of service markets. Just because we can, should we? So that's what's coming up from SERVSIG2020. Again, if you've subscribed to the SERVSIG2020 mailing list, you'll get the Zoom details for this. It'll come out tomorrow, and then a reminder the day before. So we look forward to seeing you at our next session, and I can see Ray's on board here. We've got Professor Ray Fish from Texas State. We've got Jonathan Roberts. Jonathan is the head of the Australian Centre for Robotics. They do amazing stuff with saving the barrier reef with robots, surgical robots. So he's going to be talking a lot about how do you keep humanity at the centre when you've got robots. We've got Julie Salisbury, who is the General Manager for Customer Experience at the Department of Transport and Main Roads. She'll be talking about a range of things, including digital licensing and seamless transport. So integrating Uber with public transport and a whole range of different things. And this will all be moderated by Kara Walsh, who works across a number of fields in the area of marketing innovation. And she's also a member of the QUT School of Marketing's advisory board. So thank you all very much for coming along. The recording of today will be available on the SERVSIG YouTube site, and we hope to see you all next week at our panel. So thank you, and have a great day or great evening wherever you are in the world.
Thank you.
Thanks.